Hello and welcome, my name is Laura Penrose. I am the designer of the Stella Quilt collection. You've clicked on this video because you are interested in knitting either the Stella Quilt cushion or blanket, and I'm here to tell you everything you need to know about these patterns, because the blanket in particular it's a big project, it's a big commitment, and so you're going to want to know all the information before you commit to something like this. And there's a lot of information to take in. Of course, all this information is available on the Ravelry listings, in the pattern, and on my website. However, if you're anything like me, sometimes you just want to hear someone explain it to you rather than have to sit and read. I also put out on my Instagram a question box for any questions about the pattern, so kind of an FAQ situation. So if you have any specific questions in mind, have a look in the description box below and I will create chapters, so every kind of thing that I address, every subject I cover, so you can click to the bit that you would like to listen to rather than having to scroll through the whole video if you've just got one thing in mind. So first of all, a little bit of information about the patterns, because this might be the first time you've seen these patterns. You might have no idea what I'm talking about, but the Stella Quilt collection is a collection of patterns. You have a cushion pattern and a blanket pattern, and there is also an expansion pattern, and they are all based on, you can see the cushion right here, they are based on quilted motifs that you see in traditional quilting, blankets and throws and things, but knitted. So the idea is that you can create a motif, a star. In the quilting world it's called a block, but I didn't want to use quilting specific terms because that's not something I 100% know about, and I didn't want to get it wrong. I think different people use different terms, so I'm just sticking to my own terminology. And so you can create your own motif and either make a cushion cover or a blanket with it. A quick bit about terminology. There are three main words I use to describe the different sections of the Stella collection, and that is motif, which is the entire finished panel, square, which is one of the squares within the motif, and triangle, which is half of the square. I'll pop a little diagram in for you just to keep things clear and simple. The original Stella pattern has two motifs, two slight variations on a star, basically, hence Stella, and there are different ways in which you can use those motifs to create slightly different looks as well, depending on how you use your yarn. However, if you're looking for something different, that's where the expansion comes into play, and in the expansion you have 5 new motifs and a design your own section. The expansion pattern is designed to go alongside either the cushion or the blanket, so you do need to own those patterns already, because those are where you get your instructions on how to physically make the blanket or the cushion cover. And then the expansion just has fresh charts in it. So for example, like a colourwork chart, it's like that, it's an image, and that's what's in the expansion pack. So everything you need to know to create the different motifs, which you then apply to your cushion or blanket. Over on Ravelry, if you purchase the cushion and the blanket, you get the expansion pack for free. That works retrospectively, so if you bought the cushion pattern when it released last year and are now buying the blanket pattern as well, if you add the expansion to your cart, it should discount the expansion. Ravelry promotions can be quite finicky, so if there are ever any problems with it, feel free to drop me a message. The best way to get hold of me is via email. I don't check my Ravelry inbox or my Instagram inboxes very often, so if you have a question or you think there might be an issue with any of the promotions or anything, email is the best, and that is in the description box below. The pattern shows you how to make an individual motif in a modular way, so a single square on it, a single motif on its own. There's no seaming, and you can either make all your motifs separately and then seam them together at the end like I did, or you can join as you go. So you're working on the whole blanket as one piece with no seaming at all, or separate pieces and you seam them. I would always recommend going for the seaming option because it makes a much more portable project. It's much easier to kind of change things up if you're not sure how you want to arrange things. I ended up arranging my blanket completely differently to how I originally planned, and I was able to do that because it was seamed. And also the seaming option is really, really simple. There's no mattress stitch, there's no hand sewing, it's all done with either a crochet hook or a knitting needle. It's really simple, really easy, and there is full video instructions on everything for these patterns. So there's a tutorial for the cushion and there's a tutorial for the blanket that are within the patterns. And it's a full video showing you everything you need to do. So it is a big undertaking, this pattern, but I've written the patterns in a way to make it as fun and enjoyable as possible. So when I looked through the questions I was asked on Instagram, the two main questions that I received were, what are the differences between the blanket and the cushion? Why do I need to buy both? Why can't I just use one? And the others was all about yarn, how much yarn you need, how to use the yarn. So they're probably the two biggest topics that I'm going to cover, but I am just going to go through and do a couple of other bits and pieces as well. I've also got loads of notes on my phone of things I've thought about whilst making my samples, writing the patterns, things that you might find helpful. So I'll start with the big question: what's the difference between the blanket and the cushion pattern, and why would I buy the blanket if I already own the cushion? So the cushion pattern is written, the stitch counts in it are written specifically to make a cushion cover of a specific size. In the cushion pattern you have DK weight numbers and Aran weight numbers, and those are created to make a very specific shape to fit your pillow. The blanket pattern has completely different stitch counts and is designed to make specific motifs of a certain size to make the most of the yarn in different ways. So that's the main difference, I would say. Also, the cushion pattern obviously has the instructions for the backing and for the closure flap. You don't get that in the blanket, and the blanket has instructions for seaming, and it has the border as well, and obviously that is not included in the cushion pattern. So the way I wrote the blanket pattern was so that motif 1, which I will put this, that's why I'm sitting to the side, by the way, so that I can put pictures for you. Motif 1 is designed to make the most of your single skein yarns. So we've all done it, we've all been to that yarn show and we've seen the beautiful skein of hand-dyed yarn and thought, oh, we'll make socks, I'll make a hat, I'll make something with it, but we never do. This motif number 1 uses just under 100 grams of either DK weight yarn held single or fingering weight yarn held double. We'll get more into that in the yarn section. But the whole point is you can use a single skein, all of it pretty much bar a few grams, and then you have one complete motif. And that is in the large size motif. The blanket has a stitch count for a large motif and a smaller motif. The large motifs use 100 grams specifically. The smaller motifs obviously use less, but we'll get into that in a minute as well. So if you have a monthly yarn subscription where you get one beautiful skein a month, then the blanket is the perfect project for you. The throw size large motifs will get you a king size blanket, which is what I made, and you'll be able to use up all those skeins. So that's why the blanket is different to the cushion, because it's all about making the most out of your yarns. Motif 2 of the blanket in the large size is designed to make the most of your 20 gram mini skeins, and that's because each triangle uses 8 grams of yarn. So if you have a 20 gram mini skein of DK, you can get 2 triangles out of it and have 4 grams left over, which you could use for something else. Or if, like me, you're using fingering weight held double, you can get 2 triangles and have 4 grams left over. You can then keep that 4 grams, take another 4 grams of another skein of fingering weight yarn that you've got left over, hold them together to make another triangle. So you can effectively get 2.5 triangles out of one mini skein, so 5 triangles out of 2 if you combine them together. And I use that technique a lot. I've got quite a lot of motifs where each triangle is a different colour. You can do that for motif 1 as well, and it just means you can use every single little bit of yarn that you've got. The smaller size motifs, which is in there so that you can create baby size blankets. The large motifs are pretty large, and the smallest size you can do really is 4 motifs put together, and that makes an adult lap blanket. It's probably too big for a baby or a cot. So that's why I bought in the smaller motifs, and the smaller motifs are also designed to make the most out of your 20 gram mini skeins as well. So one triangle will use just under 5 grams of either DK or fingering weight held double, so that you can get 4 triangles out of one mini skein with no scraps left over. So if you want to make a baby blanket, or you want to make the use of lots of different mini skeins, if you've got 10 gram mini skeins, if you've got little nuggets here and there left over, then you can use a smaller size motif. You can still make a large blanket with the smaller motifs, so you just have to use more motifs. And in the pattern is a diagram to show you all the different size combinations. Basically, I'll show you, I've got it right here. So you have your diagram that shows you all your possible blanket sizes, and in here you have all your sizes for, so if you choose the lap square, if you use the small motifs, it will be this large. If you use the large motifs, it will be this size, so that you can roughly choose which kind of size blanket you would like and how many motifs you will need for that. But ultimately, you can go completely rogue with this. Within the pattern itself, for the blanket and for the cushion, I've included guidance on modifications. So if you didn't want to use the stitch counts that I've provided at all, you can use your own. The pattern fully guides you how to do that. So there's no guesswork. It shows you how to work it all out, what your stitch count should be and everything like that. Basically, I wanted this pattern to be super accessible. You can knit it. I've knit it at DK and given yarn amounts and stitch counts for DK, because let's be honest, the majority of people making this will be scrappy. It will be fingering weight, sock yarns, held double, or random DK bits. It's probably what, you know, I can't imagine many people going out and buying a whole quantity of yarn specifically for this blanket. But you could if you wanted to. If you, for example, you had a load of Aran weight left over and you want to put it in a blanket, you could do that too. The pattern guides you through how to do that and how to make your own stitch counts. I've tried to make it as accessible as possible so that everyone can make their own truly unique blanket. So that is the main difference between the patterns and the reason why they are the way that they are. So if you are looking for something to use up every little single scrap of yarn, then this should be perfect for you. Whereas the cushion is designed to be a certain size rather than to make the most. You can it's still obviously a great scrappy project, but you're gonna have leftovers if you're using full mini skeins, for example. So hopefully I've not massively overcomplicated that. So how do you know how much yarn you're going to need? This is quite a complicated one because it's so unique. As I mentioned, each motif size within the blanket is designed to make the most of a certain amount of yarn. So in the pattern, it will show you how much yarn you need for each triangle and how much of your main colour and of your contrast colour you'll need for each motif overall. It is then up to you to work out how much you will need for your entire blanket. And the reason I didn't give entire blanket amounts is because it's such a personal thing. There's no set, this motif here, this motif there. You can do it however you like. Mine is completely random. I chose the motifs based on the yarn that I had. So I got all my orange yarns and I thought, well, I've got 8 different yarns here, so I'll do motif 2. But then I got all my green yarns and I thought, well, I've got 20 different little balls of green yarn here, I'll do motif 1 and make every single one different. So the whole point is you can mix and match and build your blanket however you like, depending on the yarn that you have. So it would be quite pointless for me to give the amounts because it probably won't apply to many people. But within the pattern, it shows you how to figure this out yourself. It gives you the amounts for each individual motif, and then you multiply that together depending on how you're going to build your blanket. Speaking of building your blanket, planning. When it comes to planning your blanket, you can go one of two ways. You can either completely wing it and just let the yarn decide how it's going to go, which is what I did. I roughly knew that I wanted to kind of go rainbow because that's the yarns I had available, but I wasn't tied to which particular motif I wanted to put where. Once I had made probably 50% of the motifs that I was doing overall, I then did start kind of setting it out, thinking, oh, well, what motif would work better here? But even then, I still just kind of winged it and let the yarn decide. And that's half the fun, just relaxing and letting go and just doing it. Or you can completely plan out from start to finish your exact blanket, which I know a lot of people would prefer to do. At the end of the patterns are planning sheets. So for example, in the blanket pattern, you have a page full of motif 1s and a page full of motif 2s so that you can plan out your colours, see where they look, but you can also cut out these pages and then rearrange all your different motifs to figure out how you want them to look and then go forward from that. In the expansion pack, you have a different type of planning sheets. You have blank individual squares so that you can do any motif, so either any of the original motifs, the expansion motifs, or motifs that you might come up with. And you also have an entire blank here. So if you wanted to plan out an entire blanket, this is the biggest blanket that I give in the pattern. This is based on 16 square motifs, but you could equally, depending on what you're planning, you could do 5 by 5. You could just go wild with it basically. But these sheets are here to help you to do that. I was having a little play around with one of these earlier, seeing if I could do like a gingham type blanket, and that totally strayed away from the 16 square motifs that all the Stella motifs are based on. So you really can just go absolutely wild with it, and within the patterns you should have all the tools in order to do your most efficient planning. On Instagram I had a few questions about fibres. I have used superwash merino obviously because that's the yarn that I had available. That's what most hand dyed sock yarns are. It's either superwash merino, obviously you can get non-superwash, but that's what I had. Obviously it's great for a blanket. For me this is a family blanket and I am going to need to wash it multiple times. And my main colour was Filcolana Arvetta, which is a superwash light fingering weight yarn that is readily available, reasonably affordable, and the reason I chose it is the dye lots in my experience have always been really consistent, so therefore I didn't at any point have to buy a huge amount of the main colour. I just bought it as I went along, knowing with good faith that the dye lots are going to be similar enough for it to not affect the overall blanket. You can also choose to knit from cones for your main colour. That's a great idea. Woolly Knit does a huge range of cones, a really affordable way to buy a big amount of yarn in one go, so that's a great option too. Or you can just not do a single main colour. You could do each motif differently to make the most of your scraps and go absolutely crazy with it. You don't necessarily have to have one single main colour. You could even reverse it and have the background colour is something colourful and the star as a single white colour. That would be awesome too. But you don't have to have used superwash merino like I did. You could use cotton if you want to, but I think it would make the blanket extremely heavy, so I'd probably stay away from cotton. But you could use acrylic, you could use 100% natural wool. Again, Woolly Knit do cones in natural British wool and that would be perfect for it. Obviously with a natural wool you're probably more likely to get a bit of wear and tear, but you may also get a little bit of felting and knitting together, which will make a stronger, warmer fabric. So it's up to you really. There are swings and roundabouts, there are pros and cons of all the different fibres you can use, but in the end this is about using up your scraps. So I would always look through your stash, see what you've got the most of and go with that. You could technically use different fibres if you wanted to, but that may affect your blanket overall. If you have some with superwash and some with non-superwash and then you go and wash your blanket, they could change. You could get shrinkage in some and not in the other, and you could warp your blanket. So if you are going to choose a fibre, I would try your hardest to stick with that fibre throughout the whole blanket if you can. With the cushion, that's less important because it's obviously it's more of a decorative piece. It kind of sits there. I do use my pillow. I don't let my children near it, but for a lot of people it's more of a decorative piece, so you could mix fibres if you wanted to, depending on what yarns are in your stash. For the blanket, I definitely recommend choosing one fibre and sticking to it. While we're talking about yarns, I'm just going to give a quick little bit of advice on DK versus fingering held double, because this is a question that I get asked a lot already. So it's tricky to get your head around at first, but the reason you can use fingering weight held double and DK is because most fingering weight yarns are usually half the thickness of a DK weight yarn. So obviously every yarn is different, but in general, DK weight yarns are usually 200 meters per 100 grams. Fingering weight yarns are usually around 400 meters per 100 grams of yarn. So if you were to take your 400 meters, fold it in half, you'd get 200 meters. So that's why DK weight and fingering held double are interchangeable. You don't need to double the amount of yarn you will need if you want to use fingering weight, in the same way you wouldn't have to half the amount of yarn you would need in grams for DK weight. The amounts that you need in grams are the same for DK or fingering weight held double. I remember as a new knitter, the first time I was trying to get my head around this, it just felt wrong, but it's right, it works. Fingering weight is half DK, so you hold them together and and it's the same. So when you're looking at the pattern, you're looking at the amount of grams. That can be either DK or your fingering held double. And you can mix and match in your blanket as well if you want. I've got some motifs where I've used DK and some where I've used fingering weight held double, and it's been absolutely fine. There may be some minor differences. You might find your DKs are slightly thicker or your fingering weight held double is slightly thicker. But in a grand scheme of the blanket overall, that's the kind of thing that just blends in and won't affect the blanket overall. Don't sweat the small stuff. I say a lot in the patterns, especially in the blanket, don't sweat the small stuff, don't worry, be happy. This is a fun project. There may be slight discrepancies. You might be joining at one point and it doesn't feel like it joins up quite right, but then in the grand scheme of the blanket, you don't even realise it. And once you've weaved your ends in, it all joins up and looks beautiful anyway. Whilst we're mentioning ends, yes, there is a lot of ends in this blanket. Certain joining techniques produce more ends than others. It's an unavoidable part of this project, but what I found after working on it for 8 months and having worked 12 of these motifs, which is, let's do a quick bit of maths here, 12 motifs with 60, so there are 192 individual squares in here. And there's average between 2 and 4 ends depending on your joining motif. That's a lot of ends to weave in. So I will always say weave as you go. Now that might be different for some people. Some people like to use something like the weave and Steven technique where you knit over your ends as you go. I personally don't like that. I find it, I mean, half the time I forget to do it anyway. And I also find in a lot of cases you can see it on the front and you don't get a very tight join, but for some people that's absolutely fine. I got into the habit of weaving in the ends after every single square. So terminology wise, the whole motif is the motif made up of 16 individual squares, and the square is made up of 2 triangles. So for each of those squares, as soon as I'd finish it, I would weave the end in straight away. And at first it felt like a bit of a slog, so I just wanted to get on to the next one because you're excited to add on the next colour and watch it evolve. But if you get into the habit of weaving your ends in as you go, you get to the point where the square doesn't feel finished until you've weaved that end in. And I finished my blanket and I didn't have a single end to weave in, and it felt amazing. My testers, some people prefer to wait until they'd finished a motif to weave the ends in. That's also a great way to do it, but I would absolutely not recommend waiting until you finish the blanket to weave your ends in because it'll never happen. It'll be awful. Also, weaving those ends in is important because you will have loose stitches in the points. You may look at a motif and think, oh, those points aren't lining up properly. Once you've weaved those ends in, everything sucks in and joins up and looks nice and neat. When it comes to picking up your edge stitches, you'll have loose ones where you haven't weaved your ends in. So you're going to get a neater pickup line if you've weaved those ends in and tightened up those stitches. You can also use those ends to manipulate any points that maybe haven't quite meeting up right, if you haven't picked up from just the right spot or you missed a stitch. Again, don't sweat it. But when you're weaving in those ends, you can also use those ends to kind of manipulate the fabric a little bit and pull them in a little bit tighter if you want them to line up just a little bit better. So yeah, definitely weave those ends in as you go. And I also had quite a lot of people asking to see my backside on Instagram. No, not in that way. I think quite a few people are curious about the back of the blanket because obviously you don't see the back of it in the cushion, but in the blanket you clearly do. I personally think the back is lovely. It's never going to be reversible, but I think it's pretty lovely and pretty neat. So here you go. Here's what the back looks like. You kind of get a seam from where you've joined, and you also kind of get this little like pearl section where you change colours. So it's not reversible, but in my opinion, it's super neat and absolutely lovely. I think, got a feeling one of my preview knitters is making a double-sided blanket, a baby blanket, so they're doing double the amount of motifs and then they're gonna put them together. That would be absolutely incredible. I really hope that happens and I'd love to see it, but obviously if you're doing a baby blanket then that's not too much, and it does mean that you get a nice double-sided, and that means you could also do 2 different blankets, get 2 different looks, and you just flip it on the mood you're in. And if you wanted to do a double-sided blanket, then I would recommend seaming, making the 2 blankets and then putting them together facing and seam all the way around the edge, leaving a little gap in the bottom, flip it right side out, and then just hand sew up that last corner type thing. And yeah, if you do that, let me know. I would absolutely love to see that. Another question I had a few times was, how long does each motif take? Now, this is obviously extremely personal, and I definitely think your first motif is going to take longer than your 5th or 6th motif. Obviously, I got to a point where I didn't even have to look at the pattern anymore. It's just completely ingrained in my head, and I think most knitters will get there if you're doing a larger blanket. But I realistically, on times when I was only working on the motif, I could do a full large motif in around 5 to 6 days. Now obviously I have a lot of knitting time because it's my job. So I'd say if you're only working on it in the evenings, in the weekends, you can most likely get a motif done in 1 to 2 weeks. So if you're doing a monthly yarn club, then it's perfect. You can pick it up and put it down over a month, get the motif done, and it wouldn't interfere with your other projects. Obviously every knitter is different. It might be faster, it might be slower, but I think realistically allowing 2 weeks of gentle, calm knitting per motif is reasonable, I think. My sample, which is the large size motifs in the throw size, so it's the biggest combination in the pattern, took me 8 months to make, but that wasn't 8 months of solid knitting. There were some times where it was solid knitting, especially towards the end, but I took some time off. I took a month off here, a week or 2 off there. Like it ebbed and flowed, it came and it went. The quickest way to do it, I think, would be a lap square in the large motifs, because that's just 4 motifs, and then a border if you want to, and that would be reasonably quick. Obviously my sample is massive, so it took a long time, so it's completely up to you. If you were to use the modify sections and use Aran weight yarn or even chunky weight yarn, then you could get there really fast. But yeah, you need to be realistic. The blanket in particular is a big project. If you're unsure whether you want to commit to the blanket, then start with the cushion. I'd say the cushion is really quick and simple in comparison to the blanket, and you don't even have to knit a backing. You could sew a backing on. I've seen plenty of people over on Instagram doing a sewn backing, and you can just see how you get on, see if you like it. You might decide that no, the blanket's not for me, but you've got yourself a nice little cushion to use or to gift or something like that. So yeah, give it a go, start small, see how you feel, and be realistic about the amount of time it's going to take. You also just time yourself. But as I say, the more motifs you work, the quicker it gets, the more instinctive it becomes, and eventually you don't even have to look at the pattern at all. So I'm going to finish off with just some little bits of advice, really, things that I noticed whilst I was making mine and the notes that I've made. And the first piece of advice I'll give you is, when you're doing your colour planning, is to do it in the daytime. The number of times I actually had a few motifs that I worked on at night and ended up ripping back the next day because they were too close in colour and I ended up losing the definition. This was particularly in the case of motif 2. Let's find an example of motif 2. So this pink one, for example, when I planned out the motif 2, I find it good to alternate between high contrast and low contrast, which you can see is what I've kind of done here. I think I'd originally put these two next to each other and you just lost that definition in the middle of the star. So I had to rip out what I'd done and go back and put a different colour in to kind of break them up. So with this motif in particular, you want to go high, low, high, low, high, low. You could also use this motif and do every single triangle different and just have fun with it. Again, it doesn't really matter, but planning your colours in the daylight, especially if it comes to hand-dyed speckled variegated yarns, is the best thing to do. My phone was full of pictures, so I would kind of arrange my yarns out in the order I thought that they would look best. Then I would take a picture so that if I was then working on it in the evening, I had something to reference rather than relying on what my eyes could see. So yeah, deciding your colours in the day is definitely the best way to go. My other piece of advice is, if you are planning on doing a complete mix and match blanket like mine, in which you have some that's just one single colour, some motifs that are made up of lots of different colours, would be to do your 100-gram single colour motifs first, because you will most likely have enough of a scrap left over from that 100-gram skein to then put into one of your multicoloured motifs. So for example, across my blanket, most of them, some not always, but I've got one solid purple and one multicoloured purple, one solid orange, one multicoloured orange, and you do the solid one first because then you've got scraps left over to put into the multicoloured one afterwards. So again, making use of every single little scrap of that yarn. And just because you're weight says it's 100 grams, it's not always 100 grams. Legally it has to be a minimum of 100 grams, otherwise they can't sell it, it's illegal. But most of the times it's more than 100 grams, so you never know what you're gonna get left over. Let's talk about borders. Of course, there is a border included in the pattern for the blanket. It's a really simple border. There is a calculator in the pattern to figure out how much yarn you will need for your border. As I said, everyone's blanket's going to be different depending on your tension, the amount of yarn you use, the motifs you choose, the size you choose. So there's a calculation in there to help you figure that out. There's also some examples based on the border that I knit. But especially if you've done a big one, you get to the end and you think, oh, maybe I should just leave it. I'm not going to add a border, it's fine as it is. I definitely recommend adding the border because I think it just makes it look so authentic and like a real quilt. And actually, I found knitting the border really enjoyable and really therapeutic because it's just back and forth. No constant swapping, no short row. Well, now there is short rows a little bit, but by the time you get to the border, you'll think, pah, short rows, what? And yeah, it's just really nice and enjoyable and therapeutic. But if you didn't want to add a border, then yes, you could just do an I-cord, an applied I-cord edging if you want to. There is advice on this in the pattern as well. There's not full instructions for an I-cord border, but there is guidance on that as well. But you could add any kind of border you wanted, really. You could just go around adding plain squares all the way around and join in a modular way if you wanted to. There are lots of different options you could do for the border, but I definitely think it really finishes off the blanket really beautifully and looks lovely. In regards to the border, I am hoping to add another border option to the expansion pack in the future, but I'd have to test it out first. So if you are considering getting the expansion, I am looking to update it as we go, add new motifs, add new borders, add new advice, that kind of thing. So it's definitely worth it because it's going to be ever evolving and ever changing. So hopefully that is everything you need to know about the Stella Quilt Blanket and cushion and expansion and the Stella Quilt world that I have created. If you still have a question or a query for me, then you can either email me at the address below, but what would also be great is if you popped it in a comment below, because then other people who are watching this video will be able to see. And if there are any specific questions asked in the comments that I think would be really useful for other people, I can pin them to the top of the comments. So that way we can share the knowledge, share the information. So it's always worth checking the comments if I haven't answered one of your questions first, and if the answer still isn't there, then leave a comment below. Or if you'd rather not ask your question publicly, you can email me at the address below. So I really hope you enjoy the Stella patterns. It's been such a huge thing for me. It's been such a huge part of my life for so long, and I've enjoyed it so much, and I'm really so excited to see what everyone does with it, especially with the design your own section in the expansion. Honestly, the possibilities are endless. I'm constantly getting people sending me pictures of things. Could this be a Stella? Could this be a Stella? And I'm like, yeah, it totally could. Here's how. So yeah, thank you so much for all your support, and happy knitting. Thank you so much. I'll see you next time. Bye bye.